Cheating is something in any video game that we all despise, and going into Battlefield 6, this was a pretty big concern. Now, Battlefield 6 is off to a resounding start. It's absolutely flying off in terms of sales, it's doing incredibly well in terms of public sentiment, and whilst it isn't a perfect game and we've covered some of the issues it's had, it's definitely been one of the better Battlefield releases that has a really good basis to build on. But something that can't really be built upon and kind of needs to be in a really powerful position from day one is the anti-cheat. And this is something we've covered on the channel before, and if you aren't subscribed, make sure you are. We're on the road to 200k, and it's a great help to a smaller creator like me. And in that video, we talked about how EA seems to be taking a really aggressive approach to anti-cheat to a level that is somewhat comparable to what Valorant has achieved with its Vanguard anti-cheat. Combine the fact that the premium tile for Battlefield costs money and the fact that you have this super aggressive anti-cheat, in nearly 60 hours of Battlefield 6, I've yet to encounter a single suspect player. But all of that is set to change, because it's very likely that a free-to-play Battle Royale is going to be releasing for Battlefield, and it's very likely that as a result of that, the Battle Royale experience is going to have its own trial by fire in terms of what the anti-cheat can really do and how capable it is of defending itself. But I gotta tell ya, we're off to a really good start because as of recently, just this past week, Cronus Zen users or people who have been purchasing peripherals for macros, anti-recoil, are getting absolutely demolished off the face of Battlefield 6 already in week 1. It started off fairly slowly with a series of temporary bans to people who were using these input devices to cheat in Battlefield 6, and I know a lot of you are wondering, well hang on, why didn't they just instantly permaban them? Well, the issue with some of these devices like macros and scripting is that sometimes accessibility devices can also be caught in the crossfire, so people who are differently abled and using certain devices to try and access video games find themselves caught in the crossfire of some of these ban waves for things like Cronus Zens. But that very quickly doubled down into permanent bans for people who were using these hardware devices who hadn't stopped using them. And I've actually been scouring these forums and looking around to look at these conversations happening online, and these people are chalked. It's actually completely not working in Battlefield 6, and it's progressively detecting it more and more, so that people who are using scripts or people who are using these macros are finding themselves in hot water incredibly quickly. Now, the reason I highlight this is pretty impressive news, and one of the reasons that I said that anti-cheat isn't really something you can build upon is because for the last couple of years, many of us have been paying attention to the Call of Duty and Warzone experience, which ultimately didn't release with an anti-cheat and ended up having to build something that they bolted onto the side of the game that has never really given us results. Granted, cheating is a complex problem, and I don't want to say that the efforts from Call of Duty haven't been worthwhile. They definitely have made progress, and in the lead up to Black Ops 7, it looks like they've actually made even more progress. But for most of us who are just generally into shooters, if you look around the industry, you're seeing Call of Duty get absolutely demolished by cheaters, you're seeing Tarkov get absolutely demolished by cheaters, and it kind of feels like Battlefield 6 was a real Far Cry hope that maybe, just maybe, things would improve. Now, I've covered the nature of this anti-cheat before on the channel, so again, make sure you drop a like and subscribe. But in very basic terms, the anti-cheat that's been developed for Battlefield, called Javelin, is extremely aggressive, uses a combination of secure boot elements and TPM elements, as well as server-side tracking, client-side tracking. This thing is launching as, in my opinion, one of the most promising anti-cheats over the last couple of years that is on par with some of the progress and successes that have been made in Valorant's Vanguard anti-cheat. So much so that if you actually want to play Valorant and Battlefield 6 on the same PC, the two anti-cheats actually conflict with each other, and I believe there was an instance around the beta of this game where you couldn't launch Valorant or Battlefield 6 and vice versa if you had both of them installed because both of their anti-cheats were trying to secure the same things and ended up fighting each other almost. And whilst Valorant's Vanguard anti-cheat and by extension Battlefield's Javelin anti-cheat definitely aren't perfect and will be ongoing projects that progressively get better, starting with a comparison to one of the industry diamonds in terms of protection, which Valorant's very well known for, is pretty impressive. So I decided to take this a little bit of a step further, because I'm sure some of you are like, okay, so Cronus has been banned, but what else? Now, as a result of covering the anti-cheat situation in Warzone for a very long time now, I'm very familiar with the spaces that these guys operate in, how they communicate, how they talk to each other, and how they actually develop some of these things and get them off of the ground. So I very much continued to go undercover and have a look around to see what people were talking about in relation to Battlefield 6, how the development processes for some of these cheats for Battlefield 6 were going, and get an inkling or an idea of just how strong and powerful this thing is. And extremely early on, the very basics of quick and easy cheats that people try to produce, like scripting, anti-recoil scripts, macro scripts, have basically been completely demolished by this anti-cheat incredibly early on, forcing some of these cheat providers to try and find rudimentary workarounds where they're injecting files into regular software like Logitech software and Razer peripheral software to try and get these things to work, and even then, they're still finding themselves being detected. So at a very base level, the anti-cheat is doing a really successful job at basically just screwing over bad actors. And every time one of these guys gets banned, the only solution they have is to go and buy the game again if they want to get this thing off the ground and test it again in a live environment. So then I went a little bit deeper into some of the more conversational forums where people tend to sort of almost co-work and co-create in these spaces. Granted, the highest level of anti-cheat circumvention and the highest level of hacking in these things tend to happen in private closed spaces, private conversations, difficult to access locations. I've done my best over the years to get into these spaces to really identify just how easy it's been or difficult it's been for people to create cheats. And in the answer of Warzone's case, the answer has always been, wow, this thing's a piece of garbage and we're stepping all over it. The answer in Battlefield's case is starting to look very, very different very, very quickly. Whilst it's still very early on, and generally speaking, as this goes into a free-to-play Battle Royale product over time, things are going to get a little bit more complicated and complex. It's safe to say that EA and Battlefield have been off to an incredibly strong start with Javelin. I'm seeing guys discussing how they can't get around things, how Secure Boot is causing them extreme amounts of nightmares. I'm seeing guys discuss that they've gotten around Secure Boot, but then all of a sudden they're hit by something else. And this kind of multi-angled attack vector, where an anti-cheat is targeting different layers upon layers and making it consistently more challenging, is incredibly promising. And it means that as a combination of both a really strong kernel-level anti-cheat that is protected by Secure Boot and TPM, and then server-side detections being led on top of that, as well as potentially things like traffic sniffing and other techniques that could be utilized to identify bad actors, Battlefield has positioned itself in an incredibly powerful position going into this free-to-play release that I honestly think is incredibly industry commendable, and the fact that it even has any kind of comparisons or parallels to something like Valorant's Vanguard anti-cheat for a paid product is incredibly impressive. Granted, this will be an ongoing battle. Things are going to change, things are going to get more complex, but as far as putting your best foot forward, they've done an incredible job. A couple of active cheat makers and cheat providers who I've tend to keep track of in the space of Call of Duty in terms of how well they're operating, what their viewership is like, how they're engaging with their communities, have basically straight up said that they're not going to bother with Battlefield 6 and that it's either going to take them too much time, cost them too much money, or it's just not worth it. And that kind of deployment where the anti-cheat has such a powerful step forward, where cheat providers in themselves are questioning if it's even worth their time or even worth going into the details as to engaging with Battlefield 6, is already incredibly powerful. And when you combine that with the fact that some of these cheats will be progressively detected over time if they are developed, and there's even more layers to things like Secure Boot and TPM, then people who are just casually cheating here or there are also going to struggle pretty dramatically going into Battlefield 6. One of the biggest issues that has plagued Call of Duty over the last couple of years is that it isn't the prolific multi-$1,000 cheaters that people are worried about, because those guys do exist, they do spend a lot of money on this stuff, and chances are a fair number of them are going to get through most anti-cheats purely based on investment alone. Though mind you, there have been some hilarious cases in Valorant's Vanguard situation where these guys have spent thousands of dollars and quickly find themselves banned and out of pocket anyway. But the biggest issue with something like Call of Duty Warzone, which is the most modern comparison I can make and probably one of the largest FPSs in the space that I can make, is that it was so simple and so easy for everybody to circumvent their anti-cheat, and then when they got banned, hardware ID spoof, load up a new cheat, and be back into the game in next to no time. The account creation process was too easy, the hardware ID spoofing was too easy, there was no Secure Boot or TPM protections, which there now are going into Black Ops 7, and this kind of layered multi-angled approach that I'm talking about that exists for Battlefield's Javelin anti-cheat just didn't exist for Ricochet. So the volume of cheaters you experienced in something like Call of Duty Warzone was because any script kiddie who could open an exe file basically found their way into the game with very little in the way of repercussions that would take a really long time for the anti-cheat to detect, and when it did, those accounts that were banned, 200,000 might have been banned, 200,000 new ones were created. So when you have an approach that by default is not only deterring cheat providers from actually bothering in the first place, but also making it substantially harder for the average script kid to run an exe, then you have an anti-cheat that's putting itself in a really prime position. Now, this is step one, and of course it's going to be something that is progressively dealt with over the course and life cycle of Battlefield 6, but it's a really solid foundation, and it's a really solid start, and I wanted to cover it today just because I think the Cronus Zen wipeout, so to speak, was incredibly commendable, and it's a very good step forward in rebuilding trust in an FPS space that I feel has otherwise been pretty heavily lacking trust lately. And seeing these steps made for a title like Battlefield 6 is really promising, and I think it's really healthy for the industry. We're seeing Call of Duty starting to pick up its act with more layers of protection like Secure Boot, like TPM, which probably have been in general progress for a couple of years now for them. You know, it would be very easy for me to go, haha, Call of Duty, and claim that they just did it because Battlefield did it, but in reality, it's probably just an industry-wide step forward into better directions and dealing with something which is overarchingly impacting lots of people who game. The next big step is, of course, the free-to-play Battle Royale, where the barrier to entry is substantially lower than a paid product and could potentially have some ramifications for Battlefield 6 going forward. But considering the start that we've seen so far, I think we're heading into a really promising direction and place. I'm sure some of you are already in the comment section explaining how enabling Secure Boot was problematic or your BIOS were out of date and it's caused you all sorts of headaches, and I very much understand that. And it's definitely a criticism that isn't necessarily not valid. It's just that in the modern era of gaming where cheaters have entirely ruined certain games for certain periods of time, all of us remember the OG days of Warzone Verdansk. Many of you guys who play Tarkov at the moment are aware that there are cheaters who can quite literally overheat your CPU. It's just something that we're going to have to start getting to grips with. And I personally am somebody who am willing to sacrifice certain levels of protections within my system and give publishers more access in order to deal with those things. And quite frankly, I do think it's on Windows and Microsoft in the future to create a more closed-loop system that's more beneficial to PC gaming. But I'm interested to hear your experiences down below. I'm somebody who's clocked a good number of hours in so far and have not experienced any kind of cheating so far. Chances are some of you may have run into one or two, but I'm interested to see what that interaction was like and how you dealt with it. Let me know your thoughts and feelings in the comment section down below, folks, and of course make sure to subscribe as well. We're on the road to 200k. There's lots of Battlefield coverage on this channel, including some cool new experiences in Battlefield Portal coming this week. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.